Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's good to be here. I'm honored to be able to talk about my new book, The World is Curved, Hidden Dangers to the Global Economy. I've been doing a lot of media interviews, and one of the frequently asked questions, what are these hidden dangers? I say, well, they used to be hidden. I began working on my manuscript about 6 months before the August 2000 outbreak of the subprime crisis. I had an intuition that the global financial system was in trouble and that there were dangerous fault lines developing in our financial architecture. And I found myself talking about these concerns one evening to friends at a Washington dinner party. And on the way home, my wife, Vicki, said, "You should write a book on the subject. And if the central bankers and Wall Street know what's behind the curtain, why shouldn't everyone else? And why don't you say what all the big money players already know about how these uncertainties could affect all of us?" So I began this exercise, this journey. I wasn't even sure I would get the book published. I just said, all right, I'll try. I began by rereading the seminal book on globalization, Tom Friedman's bestseller, The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century. Friedman, as many of you probably know, brilliantly describes the revolutionizing of the global supply chain for goods and services, and the book stands as an historic achievement. But as I began to think about globalization as it affects the world of finance, which is the world I've been working in for 25 years, I advise a lot of hedge funds that are based in New York and London, the world is not flat. The world is curved. We can't see the dangers just over the horizon. And because of a frequent lack of transparency, our sight lines are limited. We're always being surprised, and that's why the world has become such a dangerous place. So Tom's book presents the first installment of the globalization story. But there's a second installment as well, and that's the financial side of the story. And that's the subprime side, where, for example, a small village in Arctic Norway can see its entire financial future destroyed because its financial managers invested heavily in a Citigroup product called a collateralized debt obligation. And when the housing markets an ocean away in Florida and California collapsed, the debt obligation soured, and the Norwegian village had to shut down kindergartens and healthcare services for the elderly. In the end, today's world economy bears a striking resemblance to the integrated markets and overwhelming prosperity of the period from 1870 to 1914. That was the period noted economist John Maynard Keynes described as an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man. This 1870 to 1914 period, which is eerily similar to what we face today, met a bitter new reality with the opening shots of World War I. And within a decade and a half, capital and trade flows collapsed, which helped set the stage for the Great Depression. Back in March, when I finished writing The World is Curved, I included a final line, which at the time seemed risky to the point of absurdity in the view of some of those who were editorially reviewing my manuscript. But here's what I wrote. Today, like never before, a courageous body of policy leaders needs to step forward with an effective agenda to avoid disaster. With good leadership, we can continue to build on the amazing prosperity of the last 25 years, and without it, we risk a new era of economic heartache. And then I ended with this final sentence: a second Great Depression seems unlikely, but the thought is no longer a complete absurdity. The world is dangerously curved. Leadership will be the difference between success and failure in this regard, which leads us to the amazing rise of Barack Obama. We all have to be thrilled by the events this week with the election of the first African American as President of the United States. Whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, this is an historic moment and an important catharsis. It is important, moreover, that our next president succeed. Though I can't help but wonder if, given the daunting economic and financial challenges before us, Senator Obama should have telephoned Senator McCain the night before the election, and he should have said, "John, age before beauty. You take the job for the next 4 years, then I'll do the next 8. The economic and financial challenges facing Barack Obama will be extraordinary, if simply because the numbers are so huge. Next year's budget deficit alone could easily exceed $1.5 trillion, given the various bailout packages, fiscal stimulus plans, and lost tax receipts as a result of the coming economic slowdown. Remember, state governments are already lining up for bailouts. Private pension funds will be next. And I think it's safe to say the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation will soon run out of money and demand a healthy injection of capital from Uncle Sam. Some Wall Street analysts in the hedge fund world, using back-of-the-envelope calculations, talk of a $2 trillion deficit next year, with the total U.S. debt hitting a whopping $15 to $20 trillion. We're talking trillion. That is why they say U.S. mortgage rates today, as hard as it is to believe, are higher than before the introduction of the Paulson plan not that long ago, the Paulson bailout plan. And we haven't even begun to consider the entitlement nightmare not far down the road. Add to this the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which has recently jumped by 100%. So no one knows where all the recent policy changes will take us, but many market strategists are assuming that by 2010 or 2011, with the U.S. economy in full recovery, inflation will be a persistent headache. But for Barack Obama, his fiscal limitations are probably already baked in the cake, regardless of the actions of his administration. My concern for the president-elect is that the country's expectations have soared. Americans are expecting comprehensive health care coverage, to name just one area of need, but finding the revenues to fund these programs won't be easy. Everything President Obama attempts to do will face the hurricane headwinds of an ongoing global deleveraging. It will be like trying to jog through a swimming pool. Not impossible, but methodically tough. President Obama will face a funding nightmare in which the banks are chock full of capital, yet are afraid to lend. I predict the Democratic leadership will become so frustrated down the road that at some point the temptation will be to temporarily nationalize the banks, remove their management, remove the toxic waste from their balance sheets, and reconstitute them as private entities. Now, I'm not advocating this because I can't imagine the U.S. Congress organizing a one-car funeral, to be frank. But there's a certain chicken and egg element that comes into play when taxpayer money is involved in a bailout. The banks aren't lending today because of the weakening economy. The economy is weakening because the banks aren't lending. The situation today, and in fact, just as an aside, I just looked at the numbers of excess cash reserves for banks. Usually our banking sector keeps about $3 to $7 billion around. It's kind of like a little petty cash fund. Most of the time they lend back and forth to each other. The numbers I saw today were approaching $300 billion of just capital sitting around. Banks are scared. The bankers are afraid of taking on risk in this kind of environment. The U.S. bank situation today risks becoming reminiscent of the Japanese situation in the 1990s. The Japanese government injected upwards of 10% of GDP into the banking system, yet the banks, fixated on preserving unrealistically priced assets on their balance sheets, refused to lend aggressively to the private sector. Japan experienced a lost decade of economic activity. Today's international financial situation for Mr. Obama will be just as frightening. Remember, just several years ago, European policymakers expressed feelings of schadenfreude, delight over the misery of their American counterparts mired in the subprime crisis. It turns out that Europe's exposure to risky emerging market trade debt is 6 times that of the U.S. subprime exposure. And with the global economy weakening fast as a result of this global deleveraging, many emerging markets are beginning to seriously stumble. IMF just was forced to bail out Hungary just the other day. That's bad news for the United States, but emerging markets, because emerging markets are prime purchasers of American exports, and exports in recent years have been one of the main engines in our economy, firing on all 8 cylinders. But the situation is even more troubling for Europe.